So in the first video on this topic of the essential dignities, we talked a lot about the role of the domicile master, which is the host for the guest in its image, in its domicile. And today we're going to have a closer look at the exaltation and what role they have in the dignities and what role they can have in a chart delineation. So let me first have a look at the how and why of this concept. Now, the first thing we need to do is to try to get a grip on what is actually expressed by the principle of the essential dignities. And since the studies of Mr. Schmidt and the medieval astrologers, one of the images is what I'm presenting here in this slide, is that the essential dignities and the place of an image, the essence of an image can be likened to sort of a landscape. So you could say that the totality of the landscape is actually the domicile that we're talking about, and in this domain you have certain principles. So for instance, the exaltation, which is in Greek hypsoma, is a height, so you can place it at the peak of a mountain. The second one is fall, which is tapainoma, which is called a depression. And a depression is something in the landscape, a pit or something which is barely seen, and whenever a planet is there, you cannot see that planet. So it's hidden in a sense, as in opposed to an exaltation, which is put on high. So. And then, of course, you have the triplicities, and the triplicities before they were associated with elements, with fire, earth, air, and water. They were associated with winds. So in the landscape, you can try to locate where the wind is coming from, right? So, and then, of course, you have the bounds, the confines, which I will be talking about in another video extensively, because that's a very important principle for delineation. Schmidt translated the word horion, which is the root of our word horizon, and that defines a certain, it marks off a certain territory from something else. So you could say it's marking a specific area, it's the boundary of that specific area. So that's one way of visualizing what these dignities, these essential dignities have in relation to a certain image. And then of course you have the exile, which is something that was not much used in Hellenistic astrology. There has been a lot of discussion going on about this topic on certain fora on the internet, simply that exile wasn't that big a deal in Hellenistic astrology, and fall was much more put in a certain delineation principle, but exile was not. And exile is actually somebody or a planet which is not at home in the area where it's in, so it's in exile, which is also quite an interesting idea to think about, an interesting concept. But well, that's it, yeah. So another thing I need to emphasize is the difference between what's called a domicile and the place. The word place is the word that Schmidt used for what we now call a house, but of course a domicile is a house, so there's a differentiation between these terms. So a place is actually something like this, as opposed to a domicile, which is actually a house. So that's a difference, and you need to take that into account. So, okay. Now, the second way of visualizing the principle of the essential dignities is something that Schmidt emphasized heavily, which has to do with the word Archaiosis, which is of course familiarization. And oikos, the root word of Archaiosis, is a house, a domicile. So then it's quite interesting to try to visualize a domicile, a certain image, a sign as it's now called, use the idea of a house, a domicile, where several planets have rooms, separate rooms, which is of course interesting for the bounds, because these rooms can also be indicated with the word oikos, and there are separate rooms in one domicile. So an interesting idea. Of course, we talked about the host that welcomes the guest in its house, the domicile master, and we have to explore what the idea of the exaltation then represents in this image. So again, Schmidt said that oikos normally means house or abode, something, a room or another part of a house. Sometimes it's also used for a sense of a family line, such as the house of Usher, etc. So that's the root of this visualization. We see here the image represented as being sort of a house, an oikos. When I was thinking about this table of essential dignities, and Schmidt was talking about familiarization as a process, it dawned on me that there is actually this table as such. You can say that this is an established version of this familiarization. The images and these planets have familiarized themselves with the images and with each other. So you can say that there is an established a sort of a fixed version of this familiarization process, which is represented by this table of essential dignities. So that's an interesting concept, but the more interesting factor of this is that you can also say that in your chart there is a version of this process, this familiarization process, going on in your chart, because you have a planet in a certain image, it's in a certain confine, in the bounds of a certain planet, etc., etc. And that means that you can say that your life is about acquainting yourself, familiarizing yourself with an environment which is represented by a planet in an image, a planet in a place, etc. You are familiarizing yourself with your own chart, and that is actually a very interesting concept, metaphor for what our life represents. We are familiarizing ourselves with our chart, and of course we are living in a world, and this image, this chart of ours, this astrological chart, has something to do with how we familiarize ourselves with the world around us, and we do it by means of the planets which are placed in a certain image, etc., etc. And that's a very vivid and a very interesting concept to use when you're thinking about a chart of a person or your own chart. Try to understand it as this person, or I myself, am familiarizing myself with myself and the world around me by means of my chart, which is, in this case, for this topic, it's this planet in this place. And it's ruled by this, the host of this planet is planet X, and the bound ruler of this planet is planet Y, and then we need to make sense of it all. And this is what actually chart delineation is about in the context of a consultation. So I think this is a very, very rich metaphor for how we can experience our lives, and how we have a certain idea about how we familiarize ourselves, with our inner person, with our soul, and with the environment that we are living in. So this was a very rich and inspiring idea of Schmidt's, to compare it to familiarization, which is a Stoic concept. That's interesting. So, and it also expresses something about us having different lives, and we are living a different fate, you might call it, simply because my planets are placed in these places and in these images, etc., etc. So this makes a difference between you and me and my neighbor and me, and that has to do with the things that we learn through our lives. We have to familiarize ourselves with certain things. Now, you can also make a difference between how difficult it is for you to familiarize yourselves with something, with a certain planet or a certain part of your life, which can also be visualized by means of planets being at home when they are in their own domicile or in their own bounds or terms. planets are factors in your life with which you are quite familiar and also happy with, when planets are in their own joys or in their own exaltations. And there are parts of our life and certain planets that we are not familiar at all, in the sense that they are placed in anti-dignity, or be it in fall, exile, which, as I said, this was not as much used in Hellenistic astrology. And you also have peregrine planets, which is a medieval term for planets not having any dignity in the place where they are. So these are all, you can say, gradations of familiarity with certain parts of your life and your personality, by means of making an inventory of how these planets are placed and how they have a relation with this table of essential dignities, which is, again, as I said, a very rich and very good principle of getting to know yourself in the world by means of how the planets are placed in your chart. So when we are thinking about the idea, the concepts behind all these dignities, I came to the conclusion, and of course this is something that I explained in previous videos, but I'll do it again here. We are actually talking about the owner and the staff. This is the personnel of these several images. So you can think about them as the crew. Each planet has a specific role. Each dignity has a specific function or role for the image that it represents. And it's very interesting to think about it as functionaries having a certain specific task to perform for a certain image. So as I said before, the idea that was introduced by Ptolemy to count them up is pretty silly, because you cannot count dignities or functions together and then say this is the most important person in this domicile or whatever. So that's a bit of a silly notion. Just take that into account. It's difficult to count them up and then say this makes it the strongest planet of this this chart, or of this position in a chart. That's a different concept altogether. So okay, so we can say that these dignities have to do with the manner in which a planet is related to a sign, having a specific function for it. And then we come to something that Schmidt said in part 4 of his basic course. And this is what he said. Now this brings up what to me is an all-important question that needs to be answered. There are no instances of delineations being generated by studying a planet in the exaltation of another planet, nor are there delineations generated by studying a planet in the trigon, the triplicity, of another planet. And my addition to this is nor of planets in joys of other planets, nor in the decans for that matter. Exaltation placement is only described for a planet in its own exaltation, but there are no delineation principles or recipes formulated for them. And Schmidt goes on to say, why is this the case? And he says, if we can't answer questions like that, we really don't understand the material that is before us. We not only have to explain and understand why certain things are done, we equally have to understand why certain things are not done. This is a problem that I've been confronted with from the very beginning when I started translating Greek texts. And these questions have to be answered simply. And to the best of my knowledge, nobody's even addressing them. So that's quite a statement, and it also has something to do with how we need to understand the separate dignities having to do with each image. So what is the specific role of the domicile master? What is the specific role of the exaltation master, the lord of the exaltation? And why are there no delineations generated for a planet in the exaltation of another planet? And these are quite important questions, because after Ptolemy, things were really put on a heap, and everything was understood as having a role in a delineation and the mixing of significations of planets. And Schmidt is discussing that and debating that, and he's not at all convinced that this is the case for all these separate dignities. So before I go into the debate about all the separate the use of the separate dignities in formulating delineations, let's have a look at the possible concepts that have to do with the exaltation. What is the rhyme and reason for this different formulation about what the exaltation Lord is about? So let's have a look at that. So here we see the several domicile lords and the exaltation lords as per the separate 12 images of our chart. And I always use this example to try to explain what the difference is between them. I use the idea of Downton Abbey. I use it because I know it's quite a popular series all over the world. So most listeners have know about this series, or perhaps have watched it. So these are the main players, and it's about this person who can say that Downton Abbey is my house, and this is the butler, the majordomus, the one who actually manages and controls the goings on there. So to me that's very interesting to see the difference between the domicile master and the exaltation ruler, simply because I take the owner of the image as the exaltation lord, and the domicile master is the host, as we have defined it in a previous video, is the one taking care of what's going on in that house. So that's the difference. This is not my own idea. This is what Schmidt said for a long time. The exaltation lord is the actual owner of a certain image. So that's what he said about it. So and that there's quite an interesting basic concept behind it, simply because you can say that the exaltation lord is something of an archetype of the sun, and the domicile master, the one taking care of a certain image, a certain house, in this case a domicile, is an archetype of the moon, taking care, nursing, etc., etc. That's all in the idea of the moon as an archetype. And the ownership, it has something to do with the sun, of course. So that's an interesting concept behind that, and there's more to this, as I will show. In our source text, definitions and foundations, we can find the definition of participation by Antiochus. There is participation whenever a star is with a star in one image, or they look upon it, if this image is the domicile of the one but the exaltation of the other. So here the relation between the two of them is described, and it's also called a joint domicile master whenever the same image is the exaltation of one star but the domicile of the other. So that's interesting, and it has a ramification for the rulership doctrine, as Schmidt pointed out. So let's have a look at that. Now, to understand this specific relation between an exaltation lord, who's, in the words of Schmidt, is the actual owner of a certain image, and its relation with the domicile master, which is sort of the servant serving the wishes of the exaltation lord, there's a principle that might explain this, which has to do with sect. And sect, the better conditions for this, they are called hayis, which is an Arab term. So this is a transliteration of which I do not exactly know the modern word for it. So that could be the best position, sect-related improvement conditions or something like that. I'm not sure if there is a translation for that, and perhaps, but I just don't remember. I'm not quite sure what it is. But these are the three conditions. The first one is, of course, very basic because it defines what sect actually means, which planets are in favor in this chart, which is either being a day or a night chart. Then the second condition is above or below the horizon, and the third one is being in the image of the right gender. And the exaltation lord and the domicile lord, their relation is best explained by means of this third one. So because the case is this, we have male planets that have to do with the day. These are the day planets. Masculine planets, which is the Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn, and the female planets are the Moon, Venus, and Mars. But people might object to the last one, Mars being a female planet. But be that as it may, what we see is that the planet of the right gender is placed in an image of the right gender, and this goes for day planets as well as night planets. So you can see here that the Sun is of course a masculine day planet, and it has its exaltation in the Ram, which is of course a male image, a sign of the right gender. And this goes on for the other ones as well. Here we see Venus being the exaltation ruler of the image of Pisces, the fishes, which is of course a sign of the right gender because it's called a female image. And this goes on for all the other planets. And what the interesting principle is that the planet not of the favorite sect in relation to these principles is the servant, is the planet having a servile role in relation to the exaltation lord, which is something that has to do with the idea of sect, because whenever a planet is not of the right sect, not of the sect in favor, it has less possibilities to follow, to realize its own agenda. So it's not completely free, which is of course exactly what the relation between an exaltation lord, the owner of a place, and the host, the butler, so to speak, of the domicile of that house of Usher, the house of the Sun, the house of Venus, etc., of course is a planet that is not completely free to do as it likes. So that really explains quite good how this relation can be, this concept can be found in the Thermamundi, which is of course always our model for trying to understand why are these concepts formulated and how can they be found in this model of astrology, which is the Thermamundi. Now there are three exceptions to this, which are these planets and these images, and there is a specific reason for that, which I will not go into now. So, and these planets are called joint domicile masters. So this is one of the explanations, or one of the reasons why this is the case, the difference between an exaltation lord and a domicile master. Another interesting principle of this definitions between the exaltation lord, the role between the exaltation lord and the domicile master, is that there are certain images that do not have what's called an exaltation planet, and there are also planets who are the domicile masters of these images, and they are these images. And this is what Schmidt said about them. These are the planets that do have their joy in these images. So Saturn in the water pourer, Mercury, Hermes in the twins, Helios in the lion, and Aries, Mars in the scorpion, and Zeus, Jupiter in the bowman. And they have their joys in these images simply because there is no domicile exaltation lord, for these images. So these domicile masters are completely free to do as they like. They are not in a subservient role. So that's interesting. And this is what Schmidt said about them as well. A masculine planet favors the domicile where it has sole authority, and not the domicile where it must act as the steward for the interests of another planet, etc., etc. I think the principle is clear. This is what defines the relation between an exaltation lord and a domicile master. So take that into account and muse over these principles. So going deeper again into these different roles that they have, I'd like to explain this again. I talked about this in the presentation I did for Nightlight Astrology, Acuta, who's the owner of that website. And I did a talk there on these principles. And I showed these images, and I'll show them here again just to make the point clear that this is certainly a difference between the exaltation ruler and the steward, the domicile master of a place, which is something different as the in relation to the owner, which is the exaltation ruler. So I want to explain the principle, and they are very clear in this first example. When we look at the 9th place of the fishes, then you see that there are 3 planets that have to do with religion specifically, and the first one is Aphrodite, Venus, rituals of purification, priestly rites, piety, religious observance. That's interesting, that she is the exaltation ruler of this image. And then we have Zeus Jupiter, which is the domicile master of the fishes. So, and Jupiter is about gnosis and preferments of priests, say the ancient texts about this. So here you see again this differentiation of functions in relation to each other. Jupiter, the priesthood, is in the service of Venus, which has to do with purification, priestly rites, piety, religious observance, etc., etc. So here again you see defined the subservient relation of a domicile master in relation to the exaltation ruler of a certain image. And also very interesting, of course, is the fact that the 9th place is the joy, the joy of the Son, God. And the Son is God, the high priests, and the Father are, in this case, dear Father in heaven. So, and of course, the 9th place, the fishes in the Thermamundi, is the domicile of Jupiter, the steward, the exaltation of Aphrodite, Venus, and the joy of Helios, the Sun. So, and then you look at Valence, who says in book 4, the 9th is the place of friendship, Venus, being away from home, the 9th place as such. Being away from home is also interesting when someone has a certain religious, how do you call it, meditation or something like that, or having a vision or something like that. You're actually not at home, right? You're just living in the image that come into your head. Foreigners, of course, that's the strangest place, the place of God, King, sovereignty, astrology, metaphysics, etc., etc. It's clear that these 3 have a very strong relation to the 9th place, which is also very interesting for how the places came to have the meanings that they have now. So again, let's have a look at another one. So the names of the places, God gives signs for the Father, but could also be dear Father in heaven. So looking at the first place, 3 planets have to do with birth, as the ancient texts say. And here in the Thermamundi we have the crab, as had the rising image, which is the domicile of Selene, the moon, the exaltation of Zeus, Jupiter, and the joy of Hermes, Mercury. So, well, we have, of course, Selene being the planet of conception, the nurse, the home, which is, and Jupiter is the exaltation ruler, and in the ancient texts, Jupiter has to do with the begetting of children, a lot of children when it's well placed. So again, you see here the moon being in the service of Jupiter. Jupiter is the begetting of children, and Selene is the planet of conception and the nurse and the home, etc., etc. And then we also find the joy of Hermes is in the first place, and Hermes has the rulership over children, youth, the education of children, etc., etc. Again, we see here a very clear conceptualization of related principles having to do with the planets having certain relations to these images, but also to the first place as such, defining a lot about what's happening in these places. And then we look again at valence, says book 4, page 32, let the beginning be from the horoscopus, which is life, helm, body, breath, etc. And then he also says the lot of fortune and the horoscopus is for life and living, which of course has to do with being alive. That almost sounds like the Bee Gees, right? Staying alive. So when we look at another angular place in this Thermamundi, which is a very exemplary of how these concepts are related to each other, we see the 10th place is, of course, the image of the ram, which is the domicile of Aries, Mars, and the exaltation of Helios, the sun. So this is very interesting because these three principles, the sun, the 10th place, and Aries, all have the word action as their principle, and praxis is doing or making. So Aries, Mars is of course the principle of action as such, and then we have the sun, which has to do with action and mastership. And the interesting thing is that again Mars is in the service of the sun, because Mars is a night planet and the sun is a day planet, but you can also see that Mars is the soldier, obeying and executing orders, and the sun is the commander, the planet giving orders. So that's again a very telling combination of these two. Yeah, reputation is of course the sun, advancement, which is both of the sun and Mars, of course. When you think of advancement in military terms, then it has to do with Mars, of course. Children, begetting of children has to do with Mars. The wife, change, renewal of things, etc., etc. It's all very interesting and very typical for this 10th place. Again, in the Thermamundi, when we look at the 7th place, the place of the goat-horned one, which is Capricorn in modern parlance, it's the domicile of Kronos, Saturn, and the exaltation of Aries, Mars. So Kronos, Saturn is now in the service of Aries, Mars, which is an interesting concept, of course. And the 7th place, we need to understand that the 7th place, of course, has to do in the ancient text with death, because simply that's the place where the sun, the image of being alive and vitality, goes under the horizon and thus enters the darkness of the netherworld. And in the old images, it had to do with death, deuces, going under. So you can see that because Saturn, Kronos, has to do with death as such. It's the planet of death. So you can see all the other things here, and then of course we have the planet that has the exalted ruler of the Capricorn, has to do with violence and sexual intercourse, weddings, lawsuits, imprisonments, etc. All of which can lead to the downfall of a person, which is perhaps not something people like to hear about. Weddings, of course, but be that as it may, the 7th place as deuces, death, has to do with these principles, and you see again both malefics are of course related to this place and not having to do of course with how we now interpret these principles of the 7th place, but how the ancients did it. So again, Saturn is in the service of Mars, and you can see all these interesting differences between both of them. They have opposing meanings. Saturn is the planet of chills and Mars of fevers, Saturn of inactivity and Mars of actions, etc., etc. So these are principles that are opposed to one another, but they are together working for the issues of the 7th place, the ancient conception of the 7th place. This is a more modern one because valence was quite late in the tradition, the 2nd century after Christ, AD. AD, yeah, not BC, AD. because the seventh place is that of marriage, luck, but the word luck needs to be understood that the word used there was tyche, which is chance, which was often associated with luck, but it's something else. Because when we see the nautical metaphor, the seventh place is the place where the bow of the ship is going, of course, and Veges Valens says the seventh sign, seventh image gives signs for tyche, which has to do, of course, with the fact that the bow of the ship is the place that's always in the unknown territory. So hopefully you're lucky where you are headed with your ship, and the bow is of course always the part of the ship that is the first one in the unknown territory. The last angular place in this Thermamundi, we see the fourth place, of course, is the scales. Libra in modern parlance, the domicile of Aphrodite Venus, and the exaltation of Cronus Saturn. So two planets have to do with abiding, being at home, which is of course first Venus, which is associated with the mother and the nurse, of course the person taking care of the home. It has to do with weddings, which is often the reason for living apart from your parents, setting up your own home and your own family. And those who love cleanliness, which is something having to do with Venus, the person cleaning the house. And then we have Saturn, which is orphanhood, guardianship, taking care of something, the administration of the affairs of others, which is often the complaint of people, of housewives. You're taking care of the affairs of the family, you're cleaning their stuff and all that. Okay, but Saturn also has to do with farming and farmland, so there is a relation there which is not always quite as clean cut as from the other examples perhaps, but here it's interesting. Again, Venus in the service of Saturn, the exaltation ruler. So that, and the interesting thing is Venus has to do with priestly rites, and one of the associations with the fourth place is that it's the old age, the verge of death, the grave. So that's an interesting connotation here, and of course these are all the topics of the fourth place. I will not go further into this because I think this is quite enough about the interesting relationships and the conceptualization between the relation between an exalted ruler and the domicile master being under the rule of a certain exaltation ruler. So after this exposition, let's have a look at one of the issues in which exaltation plays a very dominant role in the ancient astrology, of course, because this is somewhat new perhaps to listeners, and it's a part of the Hellenistic tradition, and I think it's later continued in the Arabic astrology and the medieval tradition. So let's have a look at this principle of participation and joint domicile masters. So the definition that I'm about to show you, of course, is about participation and the joint domicile mastership, and I have talked about this in previous videos. So let's have a look at it again. Here, the official definition from Definition and Foundations is whenever the one is the domicile master of an image and the exaltation ruler, the exaltation master. So these two are joint domicile masters, and this is the example given. So in the table you see the principle of the planets that have domicile mastership over the images of the same elemental triplicity are the ones that are taken into consideration. Because there's also discussion, and Schmidt was not explicit about that, but he mentioned the possibility that it could also be about the triplicity rulers, which are of course different than the domicile rulers of the three images belonging to a certain element. So that's an option, but here it says this specifically, as Schmidt said, but again he also held the possibility that the other option is also a possibility for joint domicile mastership, because triplicity rulers rule over a group of images, which is of course akin to joint domicile mastership, but I'm using these as an example, and I use these in my delineations as alternatives to whenever a domicile ruler is in aversion to its domicile. So, and this quotation that I just put in the yellow text, there are two other planets that can be considered joint domicile lords, which are the ones in the trigonal interval. So these are the planets belonging to the images of the same element. So there you have them, and this table you can use to try to find an oikodespotes. Now, as you can see, there are certain images that do not have an exaltation ruler, and they have the three triplets, the other two possible joint domicile masters. But the question often is there an alternative for this exaltation? And interestingly enough, it is provided by Porphyry, because he says that the luminaries can be taken in that case, and which is of course the light of the sect pertaining to this specific chart, that can function as an alternative to the domicile master, to the exaltation ruler. So you have these possibilities, and that's an interesting one. I had not noticed it or did not use this in any way, shape or form. And my proviso would be, I would refer to these more general significators functioning as possible the exaltation replacement, only if the other two joint domicile masters have are in aversion to the specific domicile. So that's an interesting one. And as I said, I did not look at this before, but my own chart is an interesting example of this. So let me show you that one. So in my own chart, there is an interesting example of this, and it's quite an important one for me. So let me show you. I'm referring to my rising image, which is the crab. And when we look at the three possible rulers of this image in my chart, they're all in aversion. So you can see the moon, a domicile master of the crab, is in the lion, which is in aversion to the crab. We can take Jupiter, the exalted ruler of this image, which is in the sixth place, which is also in aversion to the rising image, the crab itself. And then we have the possible Mars, of course, which is the other ruler of the water image, which is in this case the scorpion, which is also in aversion. So this leaves me with no steersman at my oar, so to speak. So and this is also a bit a diversion from the idea that whenever there is no exalted ruler, you can use one of the lights. But when I do so for my chart, then of course I come to the sun, because I have a day chart, and then we find possibility of the sun being the ruler by default, simply because the other ones are all in aversion. And I must say that I truly recognize the principle of the sun being such an important influence in steering the way that I steer my life. Has a lot to do with the sun and with Aries, of course. Well, I must say this is a very intriguing possibility for me to try to understand whenever there is an aversion, such as in my case, that all the possible rulers that have anything to do with a certain image in my chart or in any chart might be taken up by the sect light, because the sect light, of course, has some significance for the life as a whole. So perhaps that is a possibility, and in my case, that's an interesting one. And I must say, I quite understand the way that the sun has, of course, shaped a lot of the things that I did in my life. But other people would say, well, yeah, well, that's obvious because it's in the 10th place and it has a pretty strong connection with your rising degree, the horoscopos, which is true because it's pretty close and moving towards it. So, yeah, you could say that the sun, of course, is an important factor because it's in superior position to my rising image. But it's an intriguing possibility, but perhaps things are conflagrating here in this case, in my case. So, but please try to use this material and try to see whether or not you can understand whenever one of these other planets is taking over the rulership of a certain place. That it then becomes a very important factor in handling the stuff that's going on relative to that place. So it's an alternative ruler of a house, I guess. Now, as you know, I started this series of videos and these specific talks about the essential dignities, trying to formulate principles to use in delineation. So my first inkling of this was the definitions. The definition of exaltation says that it's sort of lifting something up to occupy a height, etc., to gain a height. And Schmidt was initially of the opinion that the exaltation planet is the actual owner of a domicile. So I first guessed that the task of the exaltation rule is to be a joint domicile master, replacing the domicile lord of a certain image whenever this domicile master is in aversion to its image. So but there are some certain provisos to that, because as Schmidt explained, there are no instances of delineations being generated by studying a planet in the exaltation of another planet. So that is quite a thing to say and something to realize. So I changed my vision on this somewhat, and I think that's more in accord with what Schmidt tried to say about this, which might be a conclusion to the fact that there are no delineations found about these things in the ancient literature. So this is not in order here, I think. So my next possibility is that the task of the exaltation lord then is managing the affairs of a place. So not the image and the domicile where a planet is located when the domicile master is in aversion, because we're just concluded that as there are no delineations based on this, we cannot say that the role of the exaltation lord is to generate delineations based on the idea that it mixes the significations of a planet in a certain domicile with the ruler of the exaltation of the said image. So, but there's something else going on, because we also take into account the idea that certain planets are rulers of houses, which are actually the places of the chart, which are the 12 images as houses now, as places in this case. And then we must try to understand that perhaps the exaltation ruler has the function of being the replacement of the manager of the affairs of the place of this specific house, of this specific indicator of certain topics in the native's life. So that might be interesting to take into account. So there we have a certain principle. Okay. Now, one of the things that were also said and put into discussion is the idea that whenever a planet is the joint domicile master of an image which is actually one of its anti-dignities, that these should be disregarded as being a possible joint domicile master. So this is the case for the crab, where Mars is a possible sun oikodespotes, a joint domicile master. It is the case for Venus, and it's the case for the moon in Scorpio as a possible replacement for the aversion of the domicile master. But when my conjecture is correct, that we cannot use the planet as a replacement in this case, as being not a valid replacement for an image, perhaps we can still understand it to be a joint domicile master, in the sense that it rules the place instead of the planet that is in aversion to it. So when that is the case, then the idea of that the exaltation ruler not being able to signify things for an image, that it can be used as trying to manage the affairs of a certain place, because as we have understood now, when the image always retains the significations of the domicile master, which we have now called the host of a certain image, simply because the table of dignities has to do with a principle of an established version of all these dignities, and the significations of the image and the significations of the domicile master have familiarized themselves with each other. So the significations of a certain planet are also connected to the image of which it is the domicile master. So these are intertwined. Whenever the domicile master itself is in aversion, that doesn't mean that the signification of a certain image still retains the significations of the planet that has to do with it. So whenever the ruler of say Libra, the scales, is in aversion, then you still will have significations having to do with Venus-like things in whenever a planet is in Libra, in the scales. So that was a principle that was firmly established, and now we can try to understand perhaps the joint domicile mastership whenever it's the rule of the exaltation of a said image, that it can perhaps function as an alternative ruler of the place, so an alternative house ruler, as opposed to a house ruler that is in aversion to its own place. So that's an interesting possibility. So that's the conclusion that I came to. I think I can still use the exaltation ruler as a house ruler, not as a planet that is significant for the image itself, as a container of significations or meanings. That is not the case simply because we have the fact that there are no recipes found in ancient texts about what it means whenever a planet is in the domicile, or sorry, in the exaltation of the exaltation ruler of a planet. So that's an interesting conclusion. So these things still go when we have indeed this alternation of the possible meaning of whatever it means whenever the exalted ruler takes over management of a place which domicile master is in aversion to it. So at long last I can now return again to the chart of Carl Jung, and we'd have to check which of the images are left unattended to by their domicile master whenever the butler is not at home, so to speak, and not providing for possible guests there. So when we have a look at that, we can see this, which are quite a lot. We see that Saturn in the first place rules also the 12th place. Well, it doesn't rule it simply because it's in aversion to it. You can also see that the ruler of the second place, the normal rule, which would be Zeus, is in aversion to it because it's in a sign averse to the fishes. We can also see it for Gemini, where Hermaeus, Mercury, is in aversion to it. and we see it for the ruler of the 10th place, which is Aries, Mars. So yeah, there are quite a lot of these aversions going on in the chart of Carl Jung, and we will try to find out if we can see whether or not there are joint domicile masses taken over for these places. So I'm not talking about the images at the moment. I'm trying to talk about, well, could it be shown that the exaltation ruler is now actually the alternative house ruler for a certain place. So the first place, the second place, the 5th place, and the 10th place. So here are the joint domicile masses, the possibilities for the images that are in aversion in Jung's charts, which have their domicile master in aversion, to speak correctly about what's going on here. So I'll start with in the normal row, which is in this case Gemini. That's the first one that I see in this table. And of course, then we try to look at which one of these is can see the image of Gemini, which is in this case Saturn, because Venus, Aphrodite, does not count because it's also in aversion to the Gemini. So we must try to understand that the 5th house issues are referred or are under the management of Saturn in this case, which is Jung himself in a certain way. Okay, let's have a look at the 10th place. Oh, yeah, and of course, try to understand that Saturn manages the 5th, which is not to say that Saturn has any, let's say, has anything to do with the content of the Gemini itself, which is still, of course, the image of Hermes, and Gemini still has the meanings that are associated normally with the Mercury Hermes. So try to understand that this exalted ruler is now not the exalted ruler, but this Sun Oikodespotes, this joint domicile master, is ruling the image, the place that Gemini represents in this case, in the case of Jung. When we look at the next one, the 10th place, there we see that the possibilities are Jupiter. Jupiter is again in aversion to Scorpion itself because it's in the balance, the neighboring image. So then we have to look at the moon, whether or not it has can see the image of the Scorpion, and yes it can, it does so by opposition. So the moon is representative of Jung's walk of life, because the 10th place has to do with career and how you go on with your life. And the moon itself is of course in a pretty strong position. It's in its own exaltation image, which means simply that it rejoices there. So it's a very good principle of delineation for this 10th place. So please understand that this is the manager now of the 10th place, which is the moon. Interesting. When we look at the goat-horned one, which is Capricorn in modern parlance, then we have two possibilities, simply because this image is opposed by both the possible joint domicile masters, being either Mercury or Venus, and then often depends on which if this planet is one of the sect in favor or not, and then the possibility is more in the sense that the one belonging to the sect in favor takes over this responsibility. But in this case, we cannot say either of them, because they are both in a night chart. So no, you cannot say that one of them belongs to the sect in favor. You could say this for Mercury, but probably because Mercury is rising before the Sun. When you put the Sun on the ascendant, in this case visually, then you will see that Mercury is above the horizon and is rising before the Sun. So I believe medieval astrologers would say that Mercury is a day planet, so this would perhaps favor Mercury. Okay, so yeah, that's interesting. So either Mercury or the moon managed the 12th, and perhaps it's Mercury, and I think people who know his work would agree with this. And then the last one, Of course, then we have Pisces, which in this case rules the second place, and Venus, the exalted ruler of this image, does indeed see this image, and so is the designated alternative ruler of the second place, and having to do with his finances and whatever is the subject of the second place. So that's what this indicates. So that's important to take note of. So, okay. Please never forget that the domicile master keeps providing for the guest, as the familiarization process has familiarized the significations of the domicile master with its domicile. So all these images which have its domicile master in a version always keep the same significations that they got from having this planet being the domicile master. So this doesn't change. But what does change is the management of the significations having to do with the place that this image represents. The 10th place, the 12th place, the 2nd place, and the 5th place in the case of Jung. So that's the conclusion of this talk. So, this might be the idea that perhaps the moon does not qualify for the Scorpion, but I just opposed to that idea. So I think the moon can represent the 10th place, even though it would be in its detriment, in its fall in Scorpion. But I think that doesn't matter because it's not in fall in the Scorpion. So I do not think that that is a valid way of conceptualizing this principle. So okay, so well, I'm now at the end of my talk for this video. This is the last one before the summer holidays, so I will be back with you in September, I guess, and I hope you enjoyed this one. So let's have a look at the other thing. I almost forgot to finish this talk by making a statement about what we can do with the exaltations. And let me quote Mr. Schmidt on that, because I think it's a very important quote. He said, "I'm going to make the statement that the exaltation planet has neither the ability to generate delineations for a planet in the exaltation that is associated with, nor does it really have any proper sense of dispositor role whatsoever." So that's quite a statement. So according to Schmidt, what is actually the case is this. What it is that a planet simply is made better, is elevated, is exalted when it is in a certain place of the zodiac, just as a planet rejoices when it's in its own joy. So this is where all the possible delineations of the exaltation ruler of an image ends. Whenever a planet, an exalted ruler, is in its own image where it's exalted, then it's simply made better. So, which is the case, for instance, for the moon in Jung's chart, which is in its own exaltation image of the bull. So, and please understand that it needs to be present in that place, which is a very important proviso, which the lord of the domicile and the lord of the confines need not be to generate delineations. That's a very important difference in these matters. So the exaltation planet merely rejoices and is honored and elevated when it is in its own exaltation, and there is no reason to treat it any further. So with this, I send you into the holidays, and you can muse on this and try to make sense of it and try to understand it in your own chart and perhaps the chart of clients. But it's something to think about, and it's a very interesting principle that makes a big difference in how you delineate charts, especially when you're trained in medieval astrology, where everything is thrown together and every planet via whichever dignity it has gets appointed certain equal status in delineating delineations, producing delineations for planets in images. So that's a big difference. So that's something to think about, and perhaps it makes all charts that you have under your consideration perhaps a bit more clear when you use this idea of the exaltations not having a specific mixing capacity for the planets that are in them, but simply whenever an exalted planet is in its own image of exaltation, then it rejoices there. So, okay, thank you. I meant to finish the last slide with the sentence, let's have a look at what's coming after the summer, because it's very important to talk about the bounds, the rulers of the confines, because as said, there are only two principles, two delineation sets given for the domicile master and the bound lord whenever there's a planet that it needs to provide for. So the domicile master is the host of an image, and it provides for its guest, and these two principles get mixed together, and the Greek word for that mixing is krasis or synkrasis, and that's a very important loaded word in Greek philosophy as well. And this also goes for the bound lord. There are significations given and recipes given for whenever a planet is in the bound of another planet, so we need to try to get to grips with whatever the bound signifies. What are these planets doing? Because even though there are general recipes for both of them, sometimes they're thrown together. So the recipe goes something: whenever you find planet A in the domicile of planet X, and or it's bound, so they are thrown together. But there is of course a difference, because Schmidt never was happy with the idea you cannot throw these things together simply because they have two different tasks for a certain image. So the next talk after the summer will be about the bounds, whatever they can signify, and we will try to research that for the chart of Jung. I hope you will have enjoyed this video, and I hope you will try it out for your own charts and in your own chart and for the people consulting you, because we need to understand what's going on with these rulers. Whenever a domicile master cannot function as the house ruler of a certain place, even though it has a certain significance, we must try to understand whether or not the ruler of the exaltation ruler of the image in question can function as an alternative house ruler. So that's what this was all about. So I'm sorry I'm stumbling a bit, because it's almost vacation and the holidays and I'm getting a bit tired. So, but that's okay. I'll have a good rest, and I'll see you after the summer, and I hope you will join me again for this interesting study of Hellenistic material, thanks to Mr. Schmidt, and I hope to see you after the holidays. So again, if you find any use for these videos, you can support my channel, and feel free to contribute financially, or be it in kind words, comments, and the like. I hope to see you there again after the summer. Again, if you're interested in having your own chart delineated with these Hellenistic principles, which can be quite different from perhaps another reading from a more modern perspective, you can get into contact with me, and we can set up a date, and you can have your chart read by me according to these Hellenistic principles, which might be quite revealing for you. So thanks again, and I hope to see you after the summer. Bye.